Midnight, the 4th of September, 1936. The packers and trimmers walk out of the lettuce sheds of Salinas and Watsonville.
And for the next 61 days, the town that called itself the nation's salad bowl became something entirely different.
Yeah, according to a federal agency's later finding, it was a place of police brutality bordering upon sadism.
Which is an incredibly heavy phrase. But today's deep dive, episode 11, 1936, 61 Days, is a measured documentary exploration of exactly what happened.
Right, and we are setting some ground rules for you today. We're keeping both sides in the room.
Exactly. You are going to hear about workers who were gassed on their own streets, but you will also hear the case of the shippers.
Because they firmly believe they were defending a highly perishable industry, against outside radicals.
We are reporting the facts impartially here. The historical record is strong enough to carry the weight without us adding any adjectives.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Uh-huh.
Because, a town doesn't just wake up and launch tear gas at its own workforce.
No, definitely not. There is a long buildup to the fall of 1936. You have to look at the simmering tensions.
Like the 1934 field strike, right?
Yeah, that's the real prelude here. From August to September of 1934, you had some 4,000 Filipino field workers strike in Salinas.
And the response from the town was, well, it wasn't a negotiation.
Not at all. It was an extreme vigilante response. Armed men literally fired into a labor camp run by a man named Rufo Canet.
Wait, they just shot into the camp?
Yes. They fired into it, burned the camp to the ground, and drove 800 Filipinos out of the county at gunpoint.
Wow. And that extreme violence forced the creation of a county industrial relations board.
Yeah.
Just to mediate future disputes.
Right. But the precedent of using civilian force was already set. And that takes us to February 1935 down in El Centro.
This is the Imperial Valley shed strike.
Exactly. Down there, at a shed barricade, deputized civilians fired an estimated 500 rounds.
500 rounds? That's a war zone.
It really was. They killed 2 strikers, Kenneth Hamaker and Paul Knight.
And here is the critical causal link for you to keep in mind. These are the exact same workers.
Right. The shed crews followed the harvest.
Yeah, they shuttled south for the winter and then migrated north for the spring. So they come to Salinas in the spring of 1935, right after surviving that violence.
And when they arrive, they find their jobs are gone. They had been taken by the very strikebreakers they had just faced down in the Imperial Valley.
Which is just a powder keg waiting to go off. So let's talk about the sheds themselves and the two sides of this fight.
Well, you have to understand why the packing shed was essentially the valley's factory. It's the exact transition point where the dirt ends and the industrial supply chain begins.
Right, because this is where 75% of America's car lot lettuce was processed.
Yep. They cleaned it, trimmed it, iced it, and sealed it into refrigerator cars. And the demographics of who did this work were strictly stratified.
The field crews doing the cutting in the dirt were largely Filipino and Mexican workers.
But the shed crews, the packers and trimmers at the center of the specific 1936 strike were primarily white Americans.
Including a lot of Dust Bowl migrants, right?
Exactly. And they organized under the Fruit and Vegetable Workers Union, which is an AFL federal local.
So what do they actually want?
Their primary demand was a preferential hiring clause. Basically, union members get hired first.
Okay, makes sense from a union perspective, but what about the employers?
The employers were the Grower Shipper Vegetable Association. They represented 72 firms that had given the association power of attorney to bargain.
So the growers are moving as one massive block.
Yeah.
And the breaking point comes in May of 1936.
Right. There's a walkout at the Simmons and Ice Kiss sheds. The workers are protesting the presence of what they call Imperial Valley scabs and gun toters.
And negotiations just fail completely through the summer, right up until August.
Yeah, it all culminates in the association issuing an ultimatum on the 1st of September.
Which triggers the union's midnight strike on the 4th of September. And so begins the 61 days.
And almost immediately, you see a citizens association form alongside the shippers. They essentially act as the town's mouthpiece.
But then this really fascinating character enters the picture. Colonel Henry R. Sanborn.
Oh, Sanborn is wild. He's a reserve army officer, but he's acting in absolutely no official capacity.
None at all. He just arrives on the 13th of September and checks into a Main Street hotel.
Right. Local accounts still debate whether it was the Jeffrey or the Caminos Hotel. But he checks in under an assumed name, Henry Winter.
And he basically runs the strike defense on the 6th floor. It's like a military war room operating in a civilian town.
It really is. He's sending out all these false reports to the press.
Yeah.
He claims there are 3,000 longshoremen marching on the town,
And he claimed there were red flags marking communist rally points.
which were actually just routine highway traffic counters from the state.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But that panic leads right into the fighting on the 15th and 16th of September.
It does. On the 15th, Police Chief George Griffin gives a crowd of 2,000 people at the barricade a 10-minute warning. Then he orders his men to fire gas.
And it just escalates the next day. The 16th is chaos. Gas is fired without provocation, pushing the crowd straight onto Main Street.
And marching up Main Street is Henry Strobel, the founding president of the Grower Shipper Association.
He's leading 50 deputized citizens, right? And they're wearing these pale blue armbands.
Yeah, pale blue armbands, and they're carrying axe handles, clubs, and shotguns.
The police are gassing the streets, and they even throw gas directly into the union's labor temple.
It's total urban warfare. Which brings us to the 17th of September, when the local government takes an extreme step.
The mayor and the sheriff proclaim the situation is beyond their control.
So they basically draft the town. They call out every able-bodied man from 18 to 45 to be deputized.
To issue them clubs and armbands, it's just wild.
And after that, the strike kind of settles into this brutal attrition. It finally ends on the 3rd of November.
61 days later. And the union ends up without a settlement.
Right. Now, we really need to pause here and look at the fourth movement of this story. We have to give the growers' case its full weight.
Absolutely, because you need to hear their argument fairly. It was actually a very legally robust position.
What's fascinating here is how the Wagner Act works. Congress had explicitly excluded agricultural laborers from the act.
So the growers argue that a packing shed sitting by a railroad siding is literally just the last act of farming.
Exactly. And we should note, Congress has basically maintained that exact position since 1946.
But there's also the economic argument, which is huge.
Sure.
I mean, think about it. What do you do when your entire year's inventory will rot in an afternoon?
That's the thing. Lettuce margins were measured in hours, not weeks. They had to move up to 300 cars a day.
The shippers were losing $75,000 a day in 1936.
To them, this wasn't just a strike. It was a hostage situation over a highly perishable crop.
And they were terrified of the closed shop. They viewed the preferential hiring clause as just the entering wedge.
Right. They felt it would take away their fundamental right to decide who actually packed the lettuce.
And the Ninth Circuit Court later overwhelmingly agreed with them on a key point.
They did. The court agreed that the association had, in fact, bargained. They overturned the labor board's finding that the growers refused to bargain.
If you want to understand this perspective, Burton Anderson's history book is a key insider source. It's not in our compiler's hands yet, but it's essential for the grower-shipper side.
Definitely. Which brings us to the fifth movement, the reckoning and the legal fallout.
Yeah, the aftermath. The labor board held a massive 6-week hearing in 1937.
And we need to clearly flag some contested elements for you here. First, the numbers are debated.
Right, the union only had about 1,200 members on the books the season before.
But the papers were claiming 3,000 or more workers were on strike.
And then there's the sadism quote. The board's 1939 decision cited inexcusable police brutality bordering upon sadism.
But here's a crucial distinction. The board and the courts explicitly declined to blame the Grower Association for the police's violent conduct.
The sadism label was strictly about law enforcement.
Exactly. Meanwhile, you have the Senate investigating all this. The Follette Committee holds hearings in 1939 and 1940.
They exposed how employer associations used these citizens' committees for espionage and suppression.
And that leads to the 1941 Ninth Circuit Order. It upheld findings of espionage and discrimination against the union.
But like we mentioned, it still sided with the growers on the fact that they had legally bargained.
It's a really messy legal conclusion.
It is. And before we wrap up, there's this incredible literary coda to this whole event.
Oh, the John Steinbeck connection. It's so interesting.
Yeah. So 34-year-old John Steinbeck, who was born in Salinas, is living in his new house in Los Gatos.
He had just published his strike novel, In Dubious Battle.
And he's watching his hometown turn into a war zone. He writes to a friend about killings in his hometown.
Though, to be totally accurate to the record, there were only wounded in Salinas. The actual killings were the ones back in El Centro.
Right. But Steinbeck is so affected by this that he drafts a 70,000-word satire about the strike.
He called it L'Affaire Lettisburg.
But He destroyed it. He literally burned the manuscript because he felt it was just too biased and angry.
And by destroying that book, he cleared his mind to write The Grapes of Wrath instead.
So the legacy of the Salinas strike is, in a weird way, partially defined by the great novel that was never published.
Which is an amazing thought. And it brings us to a final observation from our series compiler, who is a Valley physician.
Yeah, if you stand today at the corner of Main and Gablin Streets,
The exact spot where the barricade stood, where the tear gas was deployed, where the men in blue armbands marched.
there is no historical marker, nothing. It's just an ordinary downtown intersection.
But if you look at the sheds along Highway 101 today, the family names painted on them are the exact same names from the 1936 record.
The echoes of that 61-day battle over who controls the factory floor still shape the valley today.
They really do. The history is still there, even if the town doesn't advertise it.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our look at 1936. But the packing sheds they fought so hard over were about to face a completely different threat.
Right, a technological one.
In episode 12, From the Cool Chain to the Bag, we'll explore how vacuum cooling eventually killed the packing shed entirely
It moved the work directly into the field.
and led to the breathable plastic bag that put a nation's risk into a single field. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.